Good evening. How's everybody doing? Happy Mother's Day. Dedicating tonight's show to the wonderful mom in our house, Nina, and to all the moms out there who just make everything possible. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Belle in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Stephen in Maine, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Belle in Texas, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is page 71, Ayin Aleph. Here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 5, and today continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 7 in chapter 5. We pick it up right near the top of page 71. There are those who teach that which Rav Huna said in connection with that which Rav Yosef taught. The verse states in Exodus 22:24, if you lend money to any of my people, even to the poor person who is with you. Now, the term my people teaches that if one of my people, in this context means a Jew, and a Gentile both come to borrow money from you, then my people takes precedence, right? So a Jew who has only so much money that he can lend out, and two people come and ask him for a loan, and one is a Jew and one is a Gentile, so the Jew should lend to the Jew. Now, this is even though to the Gentile he could lend at interest, and to the Jew he cannot. So it will cost him the profit, the interest that he might have earned by extending this loan. Why does your fellow Jew take precedence over the non-Jew? Because it's like a member of your family, right? You have enhanced obligations towards members of your family. Since we're all descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even if we or some ancestor of ours converted to Judaism, right, joined the family later by adoption, as it were, well, you're a full-fledged member of the family. And so you have greater obligations to members of the family than to non-members of the family. And the term a poor person in this verse teaches that if a poor person and a rich person come to you to borrow money, so the poor person takes precedence. And from the term who is with you, it is derived that if your poor person, meaning one of your own relatives, and one of the poor of your city come to borrow money, so the poor person who's a member of your family takes precedence for the same reason. If it is between one of the poor of your city and one of the poor of another city, okay, so the poor of your city, your community takes precedence. And the master said above, if one of my people and a Gentile come to you for a loan, my people takes precedence. So the Gemara asks, isn't this obvious? Is there any reason to think that a Gentile would take precedence over a Jew? And Rav Nachman said that Rav Huna said to me, it is necessary only to teach you that even if the choice is to lend money to a Gentile with interest or to a Jew for free without interest, one must still give preference to the Jew and lend the money to him, even though this will entail a lack of profit. Now you might say, well, obviously, you should extend the loan to your fellow Jew. What difference would it make if there was an opportunity to earn interest on the loan by lending to the Gentile? The fact is that since the Jew is a member of the family, you have a greater obligation to him. But what we might be reminded of is that there is an obligation to earn a living, right? There is an obligation to earn a living. You should not, if you can help it, end up living on the charity of the community. Everyone should have a livelihood, right? And so if, that not lending at interest is going to jeopardize your livelihood, you might have thought that you should therefore, in that situation, lend to the Gentile at interest rather than the Jew for naught. And this verse tells us, no, you have a greater obligation to the member of your own community. Now, it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei says, come and see the blindness in the eyes of those who lend money with interest. If a person calls another a wicked person in public, so the other becomes insulted, and he harasses him in all aspects of his life because he was called by this disgraceful name. But those who lend with interest, meaning a Jew who lends to other Jews at interest, in which case both Jews, the one who lends and the one who borrows, in an interest-bearing loan that is prohibited for one Jew to lend to another with interest. So both of these people have transgressed this law. And here what he's saying is the one who is extending the loan is even worse because he's the one who's going to bring a scribe, right? And perhaps a guarantor. In other words, he's going to memorialize this transgression. He's going to paper the transgression, right? Bad enough that he's going to, violate the Torah law that says he cannot lend at interest. But on top of that, he's going to write a contract that, is even going to be witnessed and is going to declare for all time that this person is a sinner who lends at interest. But they who lend with interest bring witnesses and a scribe and a pen and ink. And they write and sign a document that testifies not just that so-and-so is lending to so-and-so at interest, but what this really says is that so-and-so denies the existence of the God of Israel, as the very fact that he lent with interest in defiance of the Torah is tantamount to a denial of the existence of God, and how much worse to pronounce it to the world by capturing it in a written document with witnesses, signed with ink. It is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, concerning anyone who has money and lends it without interest, the verse says about him, he who has not given his money with interest and who has not taken a bribe against the innocent, he who does these shall never collapse. That's Psalm 15, verse 5. From this statement, the opposite can also be inferred. You learn from this that concerning anyone who lends his money to others with interest, his property, meaning his financial standing, collapses. And the Gemara asks, but we see people who do not lend money with interest, and nevertheless their property collapses. And Rabbi Elazar says there is still a difference. Those who do not lend money with interest collapse, but ultimately rise. But these who lend with interest collapse and do not rise again. Now, of course, it's very similar to the question of why do the wicked prosper in this world? Why do the righteous suffer? We can obviously find many anecdotal counterexamples to this. People who behave abominably, violate all kinds of Torah laws and seem to be successful and, still have their fortune intact when they die. We can't understand God's ways in this world, but we have a full faith, tremendous, complete emunah and trust, bitachon, that God is just. And since we all have eternal souls, there's plenty of time beyond this mortal life to see, how God metes out justice in the overall scope of things. And truth be told, that if everything was quid pro quo and that everybody behaved, everybody did a good thing, immediately they were rewarding, everybody did a bad thing, immediately they were punished, so then there would not be free will in this world. There would not be that same system. And that's not the world we live in. So let's go on. Referring to the subject of honest people who collapse temporarily, it is said, why do you observe the treacherous and remain silent while the wicked swallows the one who is more righteous than he? And Rav Huna says about this verse, one who is more righteous than he swallows for the moment, but it does not swallow a completely righteous person at all. And new subject. The Gemara returns to the clarification of our Mishnah, which mentioned the subject of a Gentile who resides in the land of Israel and observes the 7 Noahide commandments. This Gentile is known as the Ger Toshav, the resident alien, right? And so we've talked about this in the past. when Jews have sovereignty in the land of Israel, who is permitted to live among them, who is not a Jew? So it is the Ger Toshav, is one who accepts upon himself the 7 Noahide commandments. So that includes acknowledging that there is one God who runs the world, who gave the Torah to the Jewish people, and the land of Israel to the Jewish people, right? So it makes sense that one who wants to live among the Jews, who is not a Jew himself or herself, accepts the sovereignty of the Jews in Israel, accepts that there is one God, and then he can live in perfect peace and prosperity among the Jews in the land. If he doesn't accept the God of Israel, if he doesn't accept that there are Jews living in the land of Israel, so why should such a person be permitted to live among the Jews in the land of Israel? Okay, at any rate, the one who undertakes to accept the 7 Noahide commandments, he is known as the Ger Toshav. And it is taught in a Baraisa that Rebbe says, with regard to the convert, the Ger, that is mentioned concerning, wait a minute. Okay, that's the Ger Toshav, the resident alien. And then there is the Ger Tzedek, right? This is the convert, right? The Ger is the stranger. And when you talk about the stranger who dwells among us, that's the resident alien, right? He maintains his non-Jewish faith, but lives among the Jewish people. At least he has to accept the Noahide commandments. And then there is the Ger Tzedek, the righteous stranger, meaning the convert, right? The one who takes upon himself all the commandments of a Jew and becomes a Jew. So the resident stranger and the righteous stranger, right? The one is still a non-Jew, but living in the land, and the other is becoming a Jew. So it is taught in a Baraisa that Rebbe says, with regard to the convert that is mentioned concerning the sale of a Hebrew slave, and the Ger Toshav that is mentioned concerning interest, I do not know what the meaning of each of these references is. So what was confusing Rebbe? The Gemara explains, the convert that is mentioned concerning the sale of a Hebrew slave is referring to the following situation. As it is written, Leviticus 25:39, if your brother waxes poor with you and is sold unto you. So this is a Jew, in ancient times when slavery was a common practice in the world. And this is a Jew becomes so impoverished that he cannot feed himself. It could also be a Jew that steals and cannot repay what he stole. So a court would then sell him as a Hebrew slave, which is really like an indentured servitude because it's finite, 6 years at the most. But if he sells himself because he is so poor, the same thing results. He is selling himself for a period of 6 years to be a Hebrew slave unto a Hebrew master. So if your brother waxes poor with you and is sold unto you, right? So a Jew who sells himself as a slave to another Jew. And it was expounded in a Baraisa, and not only will he be sold to you, a born Jew, but he will be sold even to a convert, as it is stated, and sells himself to a stranger, to the Ger. So which Ger are we talking about? Are we talking about the Ger Toshav or the Ger Tzedek? Must be the Ger Tzedek, because a Hebrew slave should only be sold to a Jew. Convert is a Jew like any other Jew. And this sale to a Ger is referring to a sale not only to the Ger Tzedek, the righteous convert, but even to a Ger Toshav, as it is stated, and sells himself to a stranger who is a settler. Well, that's the Ger Toshav. Now, with regard to the continuation of the verse, or to an offshoot of a stranger's family, this is referring to the Gentile, i.e., he will reach a state where he has no choice but to sell himself to a Gentile. So what they're talking about here is somebody becomes impoverished as a punishment, right? Like heaven is punishing him because he has sinned in so many different ways and abandoned the law. It's not just somebody who's fallen on hard times, but one who, ends up selling himself into slavery to non-Jews. That's like the lowest of the low, because the non-Jews are not going to respect his status as an Eved Ivri, as a Hebrew slave, right? if a Jew is sold to another Jew, so after 6 years he goes free, and not only does he go free, but he gets gifts, right? You have to send him on his way, like equipped to start his new life. But if a Jew ends up sold to a non-Jew, are they going to respect this law? They're not bound by Torah law, so this would be a terrible fate for a Jew to have. Now, when it states, or to an offshoot of a stranger's family, this is referring to one sold for idol worship itself, right? The lowest of the low would be a Jew who becomes, such a habitual drunkard or sinner or whatever, that he ends up selling himself because he has no other choice, not only not to a Jew, not only not to a non-righteous Gentile, not only just a Gentile, but even selling himself to a house of Avodah Zarah, right? To an actual place, a temple of idol worship. That would be the lowest that a Jew could sink. Now the Gemara clarifies the Baraisa. The master said, and not only will he be sold to you, meaning to a born Jew, but he will be sold even to a convert, as it is stated, and he sells himself to a stranger. Is this to say that a convert may acquire a Hebrew slave? And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraisa. A convert cannot be acquired as a Hebrew slave, and a woman or a convert may not acquire a Hebrew slave. Now, this is interesting because we've learned many times that you have to treat the convert to Judaism, right, a legit who's gone through an authentic conversion, as a Jew, like any other Jew. It is strictly prohibited to remind the convert that he was once not a Jew. You cannot distress him in any way. If he needs charity, if he needs alms, then you give to him as readily as you give to somebody who was born a Jew. So since we have so many prohibitions on making any kind of a distinction between converts and people who were born Jewish, why do we have this odd distinction that a ger tzedek, right, a convert, an authentic convert to Judaism, cannot become an Eved Ivri, cannot become a Hebrew slave owned by another Jew, nor can the convert own an Eved Ivri. He cannot own a Hebrew slave. Why? The Gemara explains the Baraisa. A convert cannot be acquired as a Hebrew slave, as we require the fulfillment of the verse, Leviticus 25:41, then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. Right? This verse describes what happens when the period of servitude of a Hebrew slave who was owned temporarily for the period of his servitude by another Jew, when he leaves that servitude, says the verse in Leviticus, he shall return to his own family. And a convert is not able to do this, since upon conversion, the convert severs his legal relationship with his Gentile family, and he therefore has no family. That's not to say that he has to cut ties with his birth family, not at all. He can have a very close and loving and wonderful relationship. But under Jewish law, the convert is understood to be a child of Abraham and Sarah, and not legally, no longer legally the child of his mother and father, because he has a new existence as a Jew. And since therefore he cannot fulfill this part of the verse that when the Hebrew slave ends his servitude, he returns to his own family, we actually learn out from that the convert cannot be a slave. It's a nice protection. The Baraisa teaches, and a woman or a convert may not acquire a Hebrew slave. Now, with regard to a woman, the reason is that it is not proper conduct, since people may say that she is purchasing this male Hebrew slave in order to engage in sexual intercourse with him. With regard to a convert, why is he prohibited to own a Hebrew slave? This is as it is learned as a tradition. Only one who can be acquired as a Hebrew slave can in turn acquire a Hebrew slave. And one who cannot be acquired as a Hebrew slave cannot acquire a Hebrew slave. Since a convert cannot be acquired as a Hebrew slave, he also cannot acquire one for himself. Rebbe's question was that since it has been established that a convert may not acquire a Hebrew slave, why was he mentioned in the verse? So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, he cannot acquire a Hebrew slave and have his halacha, his law, be like that of a Jew who owns a Hebrew slave. But he can acquire a Hebrew slave and have his halacha be like that of a Gentile who owns a Hebrew slave. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa. A Hebrew slave who had his ear pierced by his own request. Right now, a Hebrew slave, maybe, when he was in charge of his own life, his life was a mess, right? He became so impoverished, he had to sell himself into slavery. And he ends up joining the household of a righteous person who really gives him guidance in life, who he looks up to. And maybe he even marries, he marries a fellow slave. Let's not talk about that for a second. But the Hebrew slave is serving his master, right? A Jewish master. So after the period of 6 years, or however long it takes him to work off his debt, he goes free. But as the time comes to go free, this guy might actually say, you know what? When I'm running my own life, I make a mess of it. Here, my master trusts me. I have room and board. I'm safe. It's organized. I'm part of something important. My master's an important person doing important work in the world. I want to stay right here. Now, he can do this. The Torah provides for this. The sages certainly look down on it. A Jew is born free. God made you to be free. You're a Jew. You have potential. There's all kinds of things you can do in this world. You should not choose to be a slave. But if he makes that choice, then there's a ritual for it, right? Where he has his ear pierced against the doorpost of a home. And he, through this ritual, he says, I want to remain a slave. So then he remains a slave past the period of servitude. It's still not forever. He will go free in the Jubilee year. All these laws, by the way, only applied when the temple is standing. And the Jews have, not just sovereignty in the land of Israel, but Torah sovereignty in the land of Israel. So he could make that choice, right? So now that's what we're talking about. Where are we? Okay, so this is as it is taught in Baraisa. A Hebrew slave who had his ear pierced by his own request in order to remain a slave after his 6-year period of servitude was over, and therefore he is only emancipated during the Jubilee year, which was every 50 years, and also a Hebrew slave who was sold to a Gentile does not serve his master's son and does not serve his master's daughter after his master's death, but rather is emancipated, right? So he's only agreed to stay on in this capacity for his master. But if his master dies, he doesn't want to be an inheritance and that his new master is the son of his previous master. No, so the Hebrew slave goes free. And interesting, this law also applies to a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile. Now, why would the Gentile listen to the law? Presumably, we're talking about the Ger Toshav, who lives in Israel and accepts the laws of Israel upon himself. And so if the Hebrew slave ended up being sold to the Ger Toshav, once the Ger Toshav dies, the Hebrew slave goes free. Now, the master said above, and a woman or a convert may not acquire a Hebrew slave. And this Gemara suggests, let us say that this Baraisa is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. As it is taught in a Baraisa, a woman may acquire maidservants, female slaves, but she may not acquire male slaves in order to preserve standards of modesty, right? She can't bring this man who is not her husband, even if she owns him as a slave, but she's going to be living, in a house alone behind closed doors with this man who's not her husband. It's not a good look. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says she may also acquire male slaves, and the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Even if you say that this Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, it is not difficult. Here, where it is prohibited, the ruling is stated with regard to a Hebrew slave. And there, where Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel renders it permitted, the ruling is stated with regard to a Canaanite slave. And the Gemara explains the difference. A Hebrew slave is regarded as discreet in her eyes. And since she trusts that a Hebrew slave will not reveal their actions to others if they engage in sexual intercourse, it is prohibited for her to acquire a male Hebrew slave. In other words, there's more likelihood that something lewd will result if she's allowed to own a Hebrew slave. because she will not. By contrast, a Canaanite slave is regarded as indiscreet in her eyes. So if she did something with him, the Canaanite slave will gossip about it and she'll be exposed as having sex with her slave. So she's actually going to be more careful, and therefore we don't need to impose a rabbinic prohibition on that. And the Gemara asks, but this seems to contradict the Baraisa that Rav Yosef teaches. A widow may not raise a dog due to suspicion that she may engage in bestiality. And she may not allow a student of Torah to dwell as a lodger in her home. Granted, it makes sense that it is prohibited for her to have a student of Torah lodging in her home, as he is regarded as discreet in her eyes, that he won't go blabbing about it because he has so much to lose like her. But concerning a dog, since it would follow her around afterward if she would engage in bestiality with it, she is afraid to sin with it. Therefore, it should be permitted for her to raise it, since that won't come up. And the sages say in response, since it will also follow her around if she throws a piece of meat, people will say it is following her due to the meat she threw to it, and they will not suspect her of sinning. Consequently, she will not be deterred from transgressing. So the sages prevented her from, raising, indoor dogs that she might become suspected of sinning with. The Gemara discusses Rebbe's second difficulty, the ger toshav, right? The resident alien, the non-Jew who dwells in the land of Israel among the Jews and accepts upon himself the 7 Noahide commandments. The ger toshav that was mentioned concerning interest, what is it? What was Rebbe's difficulty? As it is written, quote, and if your brother waxes poor and his means fail with you, then you shall strengthen him. As a stranger and a resident, ger toshav, shall he live with you. You may not take interest or increase from him, but fear your God, and your brother should live with you. Well, this indicates that interest may not be taken from the ger toshav. And the Gemara immediately raises a contradiction from the Mishnah. One may borrow money from them, i.e. from Gentiles, and lend money to them with interest. And similarly, one may borrow money from and lend money to a ger toshav with interest. We've already learned that. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, is it written, do not take from them? No, it is not written. No, it is written, do not take from him in the singular. And it means do not take interest from a Jew. So with regard to this verse, the sages taught, you may not take interest or increase from him, but you may become a guarantor for him for a transaction involving interest. Now we're on page 71b. And the Gemara asks, you may become a guarantor for whom? If we say it means a guarantor for a Jew who lends money to another Jew with interest, that can't be. Because we saw earlier that if a Jew lends money to another Jew with interest, the Jew who lends has violated the prohibition. The Jew who borrows has violated the prohibition. And anybody involved in drawing up this contract, whether it's the witnesses or the guarantor or the scribe, they're all guilty of violating this prohibition. So why would we need to learn that from a different verse? But the Gemara asks, you may become a guarantor for whom? If we say it means a guarantor for a Jew who lends money to another Jew with interest, this is difficult. But this would be contradicted by that which the sages taught in a Mishna on page 75b. These are the ones who transgress a prohibition, the lender, the borrower, the guarantor, and the witnesses. It is prohibited to serve as a guarantor for such a loan. So rather, it must mean that one may serve as a guarantor for a Gentile who lends to a Jew with interest. This is also difficult since the law of the Gentiles is that, and this was the law, I guess, among the Gentiles at that time in place, that a Gentile who lends money to anybody, and then there's a guarantor to that loan, at that time, the Gentile lender wouldn't even talk to the borrower. When it was time to get paid, he'd go straight to the guarantor. The law of the Gentiles is that he goes after the guarantor to collect the money without ever trying to collect first from the borrower. Under Gentile law, it is the responsibility of the guarantor to pay the lender and to then retrieve the money from the borrower. Consequently, when this occurs, the guarantor is considered to have borrowed money from the Gentile, and he himself, as a middleman, lent it to the Jew, with the result that the guarantor is the one who takes interest from the borrower, And if a Jew in that kind of relationship, in that kind of arrangement, is acting as the guarantor of a Gentile's loan to another Jew, it turns out that the Jew is lending to the other Jew at interest, prohibited. So what are we talking about? So Rav Sheshes said the case is that the Gentile accepted upon himself to have this transaction judged by the laws of the Jews, so that he may not claim repayment from the guarantor. So the Gemara asks, if the Gentile accepted upon himself to have this transaction judged by the laws of the Jews, he should also not take interest, since that is prohibited by Jewish law. And in response, Rav Sheshes said he accepted upon himself the laws of the Jews with regard to this, the procedural matter with regard to the method of collection. But he did not accept upon himself the laws of the Jews with regard to that, the prohibition against taking interest. New subject. The Mishnah teaches a Jew may serve as a middleman and lend a Gentile's money to another Jew with the knowledge of the Gentile, despite that there is not the knowledge of the middleman, the Jew who is a Jew. And the sage, and this is confusing, so now the sages are going to expound. The sages taught in a Baraisa, a Jew may lend a Gentile's money, acting as a middleman, to another Jew with the knowledge of the Gentile, though despite not having the knowledge of a Jew. How so? In the case of a Jew who borrowed money with interest from a Gentile, and then he wanted to return it to him. But at that point, another Jew found the borrower and said to him, "You borrowed that money, and now you're ready to pay it back. You've got the money in hand. Instead of paying it back to the Gentile, lend it to me, because I need that money right now. Give it to me, and I will pay you interest in the same way that you pay." Wait a minute. All right, but at that point, another Jew found the borrower and said to him, "Since you do not need this money anymore, and I do need it, give it to me, and I will pay you with the addition of interest in the same way that you pay the Gentile." This is prohibited, since this is interest paid by one Jew to another. But if the borrower presented the second Jew to the Gentile, and the Gentile agreed to this arrangement, then it is permitted, right? Because if, right, like I'm a Jew and I borrow from this Gentile, I'm ready to pay it back. Now my friend who's also Jewish comes to me and says, "Listen, before you pay that back, just lend it to me and I'll pay it back. And I'll pay the same interest you would have paid, but I'll just pay it to you, Sal, and then you pay him." But now it's like I lent this money. Instead of paying it back to the Gentile, I lent it to my friend. He is now, when he returns it to me, going to give me interest, even though I'm just going to give that interest right over to the Gentile. The fact is, between me and my fellow Jew, I've lent him money and he paid me interest. Prohibited. But if I bring my friend to the Gentile and I say, "Listen, I'm going to pay you back this money. But if you like, you can have your money keep working for you, because here's my friend who also needs a loan, the same amount. Do you want to just give the money to him?" And the Gentile says, "Sure." And so the money now goes to him. But by me bringing my fellow Jew to the Gentile, all I've done is make an introduction. And in truth, the relationship of borrowing at interest is between this Jew and the Gentile, not between him and me. Right. Hold on. Now the Brisa continues. And similarly, if a Gentile borrowed money with interest from a Jew, which is permitted, and then wanted to return it to him, and another Jew found the Gentile and said to him, "Give it to me, and I will pay you interest in the same way that you pay the Jewish lender," this is permitted, since he pays interest to a Gentile and not to a Jew. But if the Gentile borrower presented the second Jew to the Jew who lent him the money, and the Jewish lender agreed to this arrangement, then it is prohibited, because it results in a Jew lending money to another Jew at interest. Now the Gemara discusses the Brisa. Granted, the latter clause of the Brisa, which says that it is prohibited for a Jew to pay the Gentile borrower when the Jewish lender is aware of the transaction, can be explained as a stringency due to concern about the prohibition of interest. But in the first clause, the Jewish lender presents the Jewish borrower to the Gentile before handing him the money, and the fact that this is permitted indicates that he acts as the Gentile's agent not on his own. But since the law is that there is no agency for a Gentile, this means that the Jew is the one who takes the interest from the second borrower. Why then does the Baraisa permit it? And Rav Huna bar Manoach said in the name of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, here we are dealing with a case where the Gentile said to the Jew, when he returned the money, place it upon the ground and be dismissed. And afterward the other Jew went and took it. So therefore the loan was transacted directly between the second Jew and the Gentile. There was no agency involved. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, what is the purpose of stating it? In this scenario, it is obvious that there are two separate loans, and the first Jewish lender has nothing to do with the loan of the second. Of course it would be permitted. So rather, Rav Papa said, it must be speaking about a case where the Gentile took the money from the first Jew and gave it to the second Jew by hand. So the Gemara asks, but still, what is the purpose of stating it? In this case also, the second loan is clearly transacted directly with the Gentile lender. And the Gemara answers, lest you say the Gentile himself, when he does this, he gives it with the knowledge of the Jew, as he trusts the second borrower due to the mediation of the first Jew, and therefore one might have thought that he is deemed involved in the loan. To counter this, the Baraisa teaches us that this is not the case. Rav Ashi said, it is possible to explain the Baraisa in a different way. When we say the law that there is no agency for a Gentile, this matter applies concerning the separation of teruma. Right, teruma is when the temple is standing and a Jewish farmer in Israel grows his crop and harvests it. So the first 2% has to be set aside as a tithe given to a Kohen, to a priest. That's teruma. Can a Jewish farmer, appoint an agent to separate his teruma for him according to his instructions? Yes, if the agent is a Jew. But you cannot appoint a Gentile to separate teruma for you. In this context, that the law of that law, there is no agency for a Gentile. But concerning the rest of the laws of the Torah, there is agency for a Gentile. And the Gemara comments, and this opinion of Rav Ashi is in error. Since what is different about teruma, that a Gentile cannot be appointed as an agent, as it is written concerning teruma, so you also shall set apart a gift unto the Lord of all your tithes. Numbers 18:28. Once the verse states you, the addition of the word also in the phrase you also serves to include an agent. The sages additionally derive that just as you, those who appoint agents, are members of the covenant, i.e. Jews, so too your agents must be members of the covenant. So a Gentile cannot separate teruma, even if he is appointed as an agent by a Jew. And the Gemara continues, the concept of agency with regard to the rest of the laws of the Torah is also a matter we learn through tradition by a derivation from teruma, as this is the source for the law that the legal status of one's agent is like that of himself. Therefore, the same laws apply to agency in all matters. So rather, it must be concluded that the opinion expressed by Rav Ashi is in error. And there are those who say a different version of this discussion. Rav Ashi said, when we say there is no agency for a Gentile, this matter applies concerning them serving as agents for us, but we can be agents for them. So with regard to this comment, it was said, and this opinion of Rav Ashi is in error, as what is different that they cannot serve as agents for us, as it is written concerning teruma, so you also shall set apart a gift unto the Lord of all your tithes. And once the verse states you, the addition of the word also in the phrase you also serves to include your agents. And the sages also derive, just as you, those who appoint agents, are members of the covenant, so too your agents must be members of the covenant. And the Gemara continues, therefore we also cannot serve as agents for them, because the same principle is said, just as you, those who appoint the agents, are children of the covenant, so too all who appoint agents must be members of the covenant. So rather, it must be concluded that the opinion expressed by Rav Ashi is in error. Ravina says another answer, granted, a Gentile is not included in the category of agency, but he has the power by rabbinic law to acquire an item through an act of acquisition performed by another. And this is similar to the law concerning a Jewish minor. As with a minor, is it not the case that even though he is not included in the category of agency because he's a minor, nevertheless he has the power by rabbinic law to acquire an item by means of an act of acquisition performed by another on his behalf? So here also, it is not different. The Jew can perform an act of acquisition on behalf of the Gentile, even though there is no agency for Gentiles. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Okay. And the Gemara rejects this comparison, but that is not so. A minor Jew will eventually reach the age of eligibility for agency, but a Gentile will not reach eligibility for agency, and consequently the sages did not establish the power for Gentiles to acquire an item by means of an act of acquisition performed by a Jew. So we'll pick it up there near the top of page 72a tomorrow at the regular Monday time, God willing, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay, Nina is enjoying Mother's Day. Hanging out with our daughter right now. So let me see if I can scan the comments and pick up a question. Tom, why would they even think a person would commit bestiality? Good question. Was it prevalent at any point before the Tanaim and the Amoraim? I mean, I don't think so. Like, why would that even come up? I don't know. Although maybe what was going on is the idea of having a dog as a pet was very unusual. That wasn't common like it is now. This is definitely not a concern now, right? I mean, like, you know, it's unusual, right? Orthodox Jews tend to have dogs as pets at a much lower rate than the population, but it happens. There are Orthodox Jews who have dogs as pets, and I've never heard that, you know, an Orthodox Jewish woman who lives by herself doesn't have is prohibited from having a dog. Maybe I just don't know, but as far as I know, this is not something we worry about now. But it might have been, back then, they just didn't even want to avoid even the appearance, right? The possible appearance of impropriety. I don't know any more about it than that. Sharon says, I just thought of this, since putting blood on a doorpost was the sign of liberation from slavery in Egypt, is there a connection to the piercing of the ear with an awl into the doorpost, which retained the status of a slave? I definitely heard something along those lines. Yes, it's no coincidence that they're using the doorpost for somebody, who is submitting himself to remain enslaved. And the doorpost should be reminded, like, what are you doing? The doorpost is the very symbol of our freedom, that we are only servants of God. Why would you, give up the status of a free Jew, just because you've fallen on these really difficult times, and then you found, some support and a bounce back, as it were, in the house of your master? Okay, now don't be afraid. He's elevated you. You're going to go out with some gifts. You've learned how to take care of yourself. It's time for you to go out that door. Don't remain here. Okay, well, that seems to be all with the questions. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a